There you go. It's a crash course. I know, it's a fire hose of facts. And I already have to edit a handful of things down. Let me just land the plane for the Old Testament, then we'll do a quick crash course of the New Testament as well. Here's one of the world experts on the history of the formation of the collection of the Hebrew Bible. His name's Roger Beckwith. He's associated with the Christian tradition. He wouldn't identify like, I love and follow Jesus. Like, he's not that kind of Christian. But you're with me. He's like a cultural Christian. He's British, but he's one of the world experts on the history of the formation of the Bible. This is an essay from one of the standard dictionary, like, reference books. It's not religious at all. Do you get my point here? He's not trying to defend anything. And here's his observation on looking at all the manuscript and the historical data of how the Hebrew Bible came into existence. He says, it's very striking that over a period ranging from the 2nd century BCE, before the Common Era, that's the more neutral way instead of saying before Christ, but it means the same thing. So from the first 200 years before Jesus to the 1st century after Jesus, it's striking that so many writers, and Jewish writers, of so many divergent groups, Palestinian Jews, Hellenistic, by which he means Greek-influenced Jews, Pharisaic Jews, Essenes down by the Dead Sea, Christians, Messianic Jews, they all show such agreement about this 3-part Hebrew Bible. They're constantly quoting from it. Everybody's talking about it. You get to the time, to 200 years before Jesus, the Hebrew Bible has been edited into its unified whole, and then it's just like a boulder thrown into Jewish history. And it's just the ripple effects. Everybody's quoting from these texts. Everybody appeals to them as a divine and human word, as a source of authority and guidance for their communities. And look at this observation he makes. He says, none of these witnesses are concerned with asserting the authority of these books. Rather, they all assume Scripture's authority. What they go on to debate is how to interpret the Scriptures. He goes on. It's very clear that these groups don't speak simply for themselves. They represent Judaism as a whole. And what does that tell us? What that tells us is any inference, like the History Channel's retelling. Don't ever watch the History Channel's anything about the Bible on the History Channel, right? Because there'll be all this ridiculous stuff about how the insecure religious men in white robes who wanted to take over the world and made the Bible, right? Or paid Constantine to make the Bible. It's ridiculous. Any inference that the canon, the collection of the Hebrew Bible, was decided by councils must be abandoned. The role of later councils, which there were, was not to decide, oh, this book's in the Bible, that book's not in the Bible. That's not what those councils were about. Rather, they were confirming decisions about the canon already reached in other ways. So it's as if the Hebrew Bible that comes from Moses and then the chain of the prophets was such a powerful divine and human word that these texts asserted their own authority as they dropped into late Jewish history. And once they did, everybody is reading and talking about the Hebrew Bible. Nobody's debating, should that one be in there? Should that one not be in there? That's not what it's about. It's about what they mean and their significance. How you guys doing? So that's an interesting fact. It'll correspond to something. Sorry. Here we go. All right. So when we get to the New Testament, we turn into the New Testament, here's what you find. You find Jesus saying things like, the resurrected Jesus telling the disciples, this is what I told you guys when I was still with you. Everything had to be fulfilled that is written about me in the Torah of Moses, in the prophets, and in the Psalms. This is Jesus' way of referring to the whole Hebrew Bible. And do you see it, the 3-part shape? And do you remember, what was the first book of the 3rd section? The Ketuvim. Do you remember? Psalms was the first book. So he appeals to the Torah, to the prophets, and then to the book that opens up the 3rd section of the Hebrew Scriptures. What Bible did Jesus read? He encountered a collection of scrolls in his local synagogue and in his community that he thought of as a unified 3-part whole that bore witness to himself, that was about him and what he was doing to bring that story to its fulfillment. And as you go on into the New Testament itself, it's a very similar story. For example, we're just going to go forward. You read, what we're going to do is just touch down for like a couple minutes just on each of the main sections of the New Testament. If your bladders are hurting, feel free to go get up, but we've got about 12 more minutes on the New Testament. The New Testament in 12 minutes. Right? It is only 1/4 of the Bible, right? So we did 3/4 right there, so we have 1/4 left. Okay, so we have 4 accounts of Jesus, and lo and behold, one of them begins by telling you how it came into existence. It's the third one, the Gospel of Luke, and look at what he says. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you've been taught. So how did the Gospel of Luke come into existence? Is Luke aware of other accounts and stories and teachings of Jesus that are being told and passed down in the church communities? Yes, there are others. And what he wanted to do was produce a fresh account where he's gone back to the testimony of the closest circle of Jesus' followers, the people who saw him and heard him. And he wanted to write up a fresh account in order to emphasize the themes that he wanted to order in particular. And there you go. Once again, it's like it doesn't, it's my deep conviction that the Holy Spirit was at work as Luke went to work on Monday morning, like Solomon Schechter, right? And he was working, and he's got these stories about Jesus saying something about tearing out your eye, and he's got something Jesus is saying about sex and forgiveness, and he's got these stories about how he healed people, and here he is. He's praying, Lord, help me today. Where's my coffee? And he goes to work. He goes to work. And this is how he tells us the book of Luke came into existence. And this is one of the texts that speaks a divine word to God's people, telling the story of what God has done to save people through Jesus and invite them into his covenant family. So one way visually to think about it is to think about this. So there were a handful of biblical scholars who wanted to at least get a more accurate depiction of what Jesus might have looked like. So what they did was they located every archaeological dig that's ever dug up the skeleton of a Jewish man from the time period around Jesus, and they did these 3D scans of all these Jewish male skulls. From this kind of gross, but they did it and then they created a composite of like an average Jewish skull, and then they hired a British forensic specialties team that does this, right? That create face masks out of skulls to reconstruct faces. You guys know what I'm talking about here? Yeah, so there you go. That's it. Now, I'm not telling you that's what Jesus looked like. What I'm telling you is that if Jesus looked like anything, he looked more like this and not the white, frail, European white Jesus, you know what I'm saying, that we encounter in most movies and pictures and so on. So on the shorter side, dark, scruffy hair, there you go. So imagine there's Jesus at that time period. He's going around teaching and saying and doing things. What we have are the 4 accounts in the New Testament that came into existence near the end of the first century. And you've got a gap. You can just see it right there. You've got a gap of about 40 years. And for some people, that gap is very significant. And it's people think that somehow the stories and teachings of Jesus, what happened to them is what happened at your junior high sleepover when you played telephone and you whispered in your friend's ear, like 12 rhinoceroses are riding the pink bubblegum train. And then, you like do it all around. Are you with me? And so, like, I know professors at universities who do that in their classroom to teach them about how this process worked. I don't even know what to do with that level of ignorance in our university system. Are you with me? It's just so, okay, you're telling me that a Jewish rabbi comes onto the scene teaching and doing things that are very remarkable, that mark these people's lives forever. And you're telling me that from the person who heard Jesus say, love your neighbor as yourself, or are you with me? Whatever, some famous saying of Jesus. And then for 40 years, that person never said that again out loud to themselves. And then Luke comes knocking at their door and they're like, what did Jesus say that one day 40 years ago? I'm like, oh, what did he say again? Was it a pink rhinoceros? Was it a, you know what I'm saying? That's so ridiculous. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. So and this has been well documented. All these cross-cultural studies of oral cultures, cultures that brains aren't melted on Twitter, and so on. And people whose lives hang on passing down the traditions faithfully that form their group identity, and so on. And in Jewish culture, they would memorize and still do memorize huge, huge amounts of text and materials of the sayings of the rabbis. It's not unlike what happens when somebody asks my wife and I how we met each other and how we dated and got married. It's not like we look at each other and are like, oh yeah, how did that happen again? Oh, I think, were you at the library? I don't remember. Was I at the, you know what I'm saying? Like from day one, we've been telling the story. For 15 years, every dinner we've gone to with someone new, we tell the story. We've actually told it so many times that we've worked out the parts, you know? And it's like, no, you were the one who talked to me first. I was the one. And what we've also done is we've condensed the story because we don't want to bore people, right? And so we'll have 2 events that represented significant conversation. We'll merge into one event in the retelling of the story. Are we bad historians? We were there, you know what I'm saying? But for the sake of our communication purpose over the dinner table, we abbreviate and condense. Are you with me here? And so this is how the Gospels came into existence. And so think of how a quilt. This is actually my wife's grandmother's quilt that's hanging in our house. Think of how a quilt comes into existence. Think of each saying of Jesus or each story of Jesus doing something as a quilt piece. What we have in the Gospels are these final organized quilts that represent many, many, many hours of painstaking, thoughtful care and attention and creativity. The date the quilt was finished, can you equate the date of the quilt with the date of the individual pieces that went into the making of the quilt? Are you with me? So there you go. So that's precisely what we have in the Gospels. Is we have 4 accounts that are themselves collections of collections, just like the Hebrew Bible. It was a very similar process, but it didn't happen over 1,000 years. It happened over just 40 years. And all of the people who were there and heard Jesus still are alive while these quilts are being made into their final, are you with me here? And then we're like, no, that's actually not what he said. What he said was this. And that's why Luke says, I investigated the eyewitnesses thoroughly. He's telling us how these books came into existence. How you guys doing? Okay, the fire hose is about to shut off. Here's the oldest manuscript fragment of one of the 4 Gospels. It's a piece of John chapter 18. We're within, when John was written, John was written when you were a teenager, like this manuscript was on the scene, could have been read at your church, and here we have a piece of it, still here today. It's amazing. We have so much manuscript evidence for the Gospels and the book of Acts.